We have some really wonderful guests joining us for today's conversation. Habon is a youth community advocate and organizer. Ayesha Syed is a teacher in the Greater Toronto Area, an equity and inclusive education facilitator, and a community organizer, working with both the Alliance of Educators for Muslim Students and Women Offering Wisdom. Gilary Massa is a human rights outreach and engagement officer with the Toronto District School Board. And Aasiyah is the education and outreach coordinator with our partner, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and she will be facilitating today's conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to her and our guests to take over. Thank you again for joining us.
Good morning, folks. So I'm so excited to start this conversation. I'm just waiting for all of us to get on. So thank you everyone who's tuning in, who's viewing, and for folks who view later. We actually have come together from a number of different fields to kind of chat a little bit about Islamophobia within the youth sector. We're hoping this is like an engaging conversation, an honest conversation, and kind of, as was noted earlier by Kat, these are really uncertain times, right? And so with kind of, a lot of folks are dealing with different things and going through kind of a pandemic like we are right now, it really reminds us of the importance of community. It reminds us of, allyship, community building. And so having a webinar at this time on issues facing Muslim youth is really, really heartening, and it's really, really important. So I'm going to kind of get right into it. We have a series of questions, and we hopefully are going to be answering a lot of your questions towards the end. So feel free to kind of post your questions. We will be leaving time at the end to answer them. I do have a list of questions from folks who have already kind of sent in their questions as they registered. So I'm going to try to kind of weave those questions into the conversation. And if for whatever reason we don't get to them, hopefully we do at the end. So I'm just going to get right into it. And so when we're thinking about Islamophobia, I want us to really kind of think about, the day-to-day impact of Islamophobia. And so I was curious to hear from folks how Islamophobia is playing out in their professional or personal lives.
I mean, I think that often when we get asked this question, people want that like big moment, that big thing that has happened. I went to work and somebody tried to take off my hijab and it was so dramatic, and but that's not really how it plays out. It plays out in kind of the little ways, the assumptions that people have about you, the way that you have to continuously assert yourself in your faith, or deal with people's misconceptions about your faith, the ways that you get excluded from office politics, or excluded from being able to move up in a particular way. So I think it happens in really these small instances. And for me, at least, it's never been this kind of big moment of hate. I've had very few interactions, thank goodness, that look like that, which I think sometimes is challenging for people to actually believe that it is difficult to be particularly a Muslim woman in a professional space.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. And the big moment that people look for is definitely not our entire lives. And like as a student, I'm at the University of Toronto, and my experience is sometimes, whether it be with the professor and an assumption they have about me or my family, whether we're doing research or going on a trip or things of that nature, that's what really gets to me. Or I remember I was in a research lab last year, and one of my friends had decided to take off her hijab, and as she has every right to do, and it's her choice. And I remember some of the comments that my research supervisor was making at the time, like this tiny microaggressions, like she chose to be free, and like look at her now, and she is like this woman. And just the way that the research supervisor was speaking about her was like a microaggression, or how some of my coworkers view me in the space, or how some of my professors grade my work, or see me as face value versus how that progresses over the school year, things like that. But I also, when I was reading this question, I really thought about my experiences in retail. And throughout high school and university, I worked in retail for a really long time, and microaggressions are really blatant there. And those big moments that are not obviously our whole experience, I've definitely experienced a lot of those moments in retail, and the way people think that they can address Muslim women, especially when we're visibly Muslim.
Agreed.
My experiences are slightly different because I think when I enter a space, there is not often an awareness that I am, for example, Muslim. And so often I think I'm privy to people's maybe deep founded feelings about Muslims, often in spaces. And so sometimes I will hear the very severe Islamophobic comments because when I enter a space, people aren't even aware often that I am Muslim. And so people feel a sense of ability to be honest. And sometimes even from my name, there might be a belief that, okay, you know, she has a Muslim name or she has an Arabic name. But the reality is that often there is not often this like understanding that I am a devout, faith practicing person. And so my experiences tend to be slightly different.
Yeah, I think also this, when you wear the hijab, there's a bunch of assumptions that come along with that. And I think for me, even working in human rights, there's assumptions about what my belief system thinks about particular rights that I am upholding or supporting. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, to have to continuously have to defend where I stand as an individual on a number of different world and global issues because of what I wear or what I look like. And then on the counter side, I hear, you know, from my Muslim friends who sometimes I feel are more religious than I am, who don't wear the hijab, and they're constant questioning about like, oh, well, you don't drink. Oh, well, you need a break to pray. Oh, and you're fasting, just simply because they don't have, they haven't chosen to wear the hijab. So I really think it's a double-edged sword. Like as particularly as a Muslim woman, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, almost, because there's all of these assumptions that are made about what we should be doing or who we should be as Muslim women.
Yeah, I think that it really speaks to kind of this idea that, you know, we tend to want to have that sensationalized story, that instance, that because we like to hold on to those like one-off moments, right? When we recognize that it's the day-to-day reality of folks, it kind of complicates our understanding of Islamophobia and forms of oppression, right? Because they're deeply rooted. And I kind of echo what all of you kind of shared in terms of, you know, that coming into space, a space that is not necessarily meant for you to occupy, right? And that mental, physical, and emotional burden of having to occupy a space was not created with you in mind, right? And so I think just navigating that on the day-to-day is exhausting.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think on the side of the service provider, people need to start to question, why do they need that big explosive moment? They need it because it's an easy fix. It's easy to tell somebody, don't say that, that's racist. It's more difficult to have to deal with the systemic ways that Islamophobia or racism or any other forms of oppression show up. It's more difficult to say, oh, this is a policy issue. This is an organizational issue. This is a structural issue. This is inherently who we are as an organization, and so we need to shift, as opposed to it's just one bad egg who has done one problematic thing. And so I think we really need to change the way that we think about how Islamophobia operates, because it really isn't so much. The hurtful ones are not the ones that are in your face. The hurtful ones are the ones that you're like, am I seeing things?
And that kind of leads me to my next kind of question and thought around, so there's been this kind of racialization around the Muslim identity, right? You don't necessarily have to be Muslim to experience Islamophobia. And so considering this racialization, how might that impact our understanding of Islamophobia and our ability to actually name it and also frame it?
So when I think about Islamophobia and its racialization, I think about it as a very convenient way to perpetuate a stereotype of what it means to be Muslim. And while we know that the racialization helps us think about and examine who it is that is simultaneously impacted, who might not identify as Muslim at all, it becomes really, for me, thinking about that construct and how it is that the mindset or the imagery about how it is that Muslims are constructed, what it does, right? And who it serves, and of course, who it doesn't serve.
I think in education, we often talk about the idea of a single story, and this idea that racialized bodies are often reduced to one single narrative about who we are. And I think while Islamophobia exists for people who are not Muslim but are perceived as Muslim because of that single story, what also happens is that there's an erasure of people who maybe don't look the type, but are indeed Muslim. And so for myself, for example, I'm Latina. My family is originally from Panama. You would never ever assume that part of my identity. My Blackness also gets erased for a number of different reasons, but Islamophobia is one of them. And so I think it's also about the erasure that people experience, that you're not, you know, for me, I'm never Black enough, I'm never Latina enough, I'm never Muslim enough. I kind of toggle in these three spaces, and that's how Islamophobia shows up when it's racialized in a particular way.
And so when we're actually thinking about, you know, Islamophobia, the racialization of Islamophobia, we can recognize, obviously, you know, there's a lot of other isms that intersect with Islamophobia. And so when we're talking about Canadian history, how can we begin to understand Islamophobia in more of a historical context? I think we tend to assume that Islamophobia just started post 9/11. It's new. But I was hoping that, you know, you folks can complicate that a little bit for viewers.
I mean, it's a long history lesson, I think, but I do think that my experience at least, has been that in a lot of people's psyche, Islamophobia only began post 9/11, and really that's maybe when we just got the word for it. But I think that many scholars, educators, people have been talking about their experiences of racism as a result of their faith, or as a result of the perception that they're Arab. And, you know, I think back to my earliest my mother converted to Islam when I was 4. And I remember at that time it was like the Iran-Iraq war. And there was all of these movies and imagery that was coming out about the Arabs and the Muslims. And we had just converted to Islam. And I think, you know, as an adult, I now think, you know, these wars that were happening around the world, that were really impacting the lives of Muslims and Arabs in the Middle East, there was a narrative that was attached to that here. And that narrative was about the backward, savage, terrorist Muslim that has leaked into, or has become more prominent or heightened, or we're seeing it more now that we have language for it in 2020. But I think back, you know, my favorite movie in 2nd grade was Aladdin, and what was happening in 1992. And so I just, you know, it really bothers me, but that we think about Islamophobia as just starting with 9/11, but really it is deeply rooted. The fact that we don't even know about Canadian Muslim history, and that the first Muslim in Canada came from, I think it was Ireland, you know, pre-Confederation, you know, that we've had a history here, but still there's an immigrant narrative of us, is another piece that I think we gets lost in this idea that Islamophobia started post 9/11.
Agreed. I think we also, like, to piggyback on Gilary, like when we think about what we see day to day, the microaggressions, the daily interactions, the jabs, like they're rooted in structural pieces. They're rooted in things that have been embedded in policy and practice historically, and so looking at the structural pieces, looking at how structural oppression is really how it seeps into daily lives is important, and to do that really requires a depth of history, right? A breadth of history in Canadian history, and so looking really concretely at how long it has taken for us as a nation, or even as a province, to come to develop policies and practices. Like it wasn't until 1988 that the Multiculturalism Act, for example, came about to finally give us Faith Day observances, things that were previously, you know, not given, right? Denied. Faith accommodations, right? Thinking even about like modest uniforms. Like there has been so much policy that is really recent, right? That is now working to address what we would associate with like human rights, right? And ensuring that we get to be whole in all of our spaces as we enter them, in all of our, not just in our homes, but in the workplace, and in different sectors. And so I think really like a depth of understanding around the history and how, you know, Canadian policy has, in fact, sometimes deep rooted for many people's problematic ways, right? And so that, and to Gilary's point, like that's probably a 3-hour lesson, but we really need to be looking at our policies and looking at our immigration and looking at how it is that even currently, like what's happening in certain provinces, how it is that our peoples are being impacted, and how that seeps into mindsets, right? Because if we talked in the earlier question about the racialization of a people, well, the racialization of a people is perpetuated constantly when the structures uphold those visions, those ideas, those mindsets. And so really looking carefully at those structures is our way of debunking.
I think, reflecting even on the fact we started with the land acknowledgement. And why do we start with the land acknowledgement? Right. Because that's an understanding of where this country started, right? What did it start with? It started with the erasure and elimination of Indigenous peoples, or the attempt to eliminate Indigenous peoples. But framed around that mindset was an idea of who belonged here and who didn't. And definitely the people, sitting on this panel were not included in that definition of Canadianness. And so that was from how we started, how Canada was born as a country, as a nation, with the erasure of Indigenous people, and along with that came the erasure of other bodies, or bringing people who looked like us for indentured laborers, or in other ways excluding them from being able to have rights. And we know the history of Black people in Canada, who many of them were freed slaves, and there's lots of documentation that says that those who came as slaves on the transatlantic slave trade were in fact Muslim, and had to hide their religious identity. And so thinking about all of those kind of nuances, it's important for us to not think about, rewrite history essentially, more so because it's not documented in a particular way, and that is also another piece of history that I think is important to think about, but that it didn't start 9/11. In 9/11, I think that the Muslim community began to see a critical mass in these countries, and we began to name what was happening to us. But definitely our experiences with Islamophobia, our families' experiences with Islamophobia, for those of us who have been here for a long time, you talk to a grandparent or an aunt or uncle who's been here for many generations, and they'll tell you the challenges that they had with Islamophobia when they didn't have a name for it.
Yeah, I think one thing that almost that really sticks with me is I was in a Dollarama a few years ago, and I was in a lineup. I remember kind of bypassing two women, got into the line, and as I was waiting in line, I noticed like their whisperings got louder. So the two ladies kind of ended up behind me in line, and as I was waiting there, I started hearing them speak about Muslim women, the whole litany of bigoted remarks that you can think of, things about hijab, things about immigrants, things about who does she think she is, and me like kind of almost being taken aback, but also having the knowledge. So I recognize that yes, I did have the privilege of having like an understanding of where this is coming from, but so we had a back and forth. But in that moment, as I reflect on it and as I spoke with folks, I was really shooken by it, because I began to think, what allowed these folks, right? So these two white women essentially, to feel okay to say that, right, in that space. And so, in speaking with other folks, they noted that, that was a nation building moment, right? So when we're kind of engaging in this conversation, for me, it really helps for me to, even in my current space, to kind of historicize that moment, right? So to recognize that this is through a history of colonization, this is through a history of imperialism, neoliberalism, because I think our history, it lives on, right? It's in our present. It's playing out right now. There are current neo-colonial practices that are taking place. There are current, anti-Black racism is rampant. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And so I think historicizing our current encounters is almost as a way for me to kind of, I wouldn't say cope, but to kind of understand what's happening. Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to kind of also talk a little bit about what does the Muslim community actually look like in Canada, because there's a lot of stereotypes, some misunderstandings, and what does the Muslim population look like? And I know, Gilary, you alluded to kind of the diversity of the Muslim population, but if we can expand a little bit. on that.
I mean, living in Toronto, you know that there is a very large Muslim community here in Toronto, that we come from very diverse backgrounds. And I think that because Islamophobia relies on this single story and building a caricature out of who is Muslim, that gets lost, the diversity gets lost. And so you can find a mosque for every ethnic group in Toronto, for better or for worse, and that should give you an example of how diverse the community is. The first mosque in Toronto that was built was actually by the Bosnian community, which, you know, when you think about Bosnia, you rarely think about that that's a community that has many Muslims, but in fact they were the first Muslim community to organize in the city. So we're diverse around racial lines, we're diverse around ethnic lines, class backgrounds, political backgrounds, gender identity, sexuality, ability, all of those things, all of the diversity that exists in your community exists in our community as well. And so I think it becomes challenging when we're talking about how do service providers support the needs of Muslims, because it really does require you to get to know the Muslim that you're supporting, because not one of us is the same. We have different experiences and we have different needs. And I think that's the one thing that, you know, if you drive anything home, is that we are a diverse community. And so you need to talk to us and get to know us and not be afraid to ask those uncomfortable questions, to ensure that you really know what the community needs are for the specific Muslims that you're supporting.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of touches into our next section around kind of what are the experiences of Muslim youth in Canada, and the importance of adopting kind of that intersectional lens that you kind of already alluded to. But if folks can kind of share, you know, from their work, from their own experience, I know Habon, I'm sure you have, but what is it like being a young Muslim in our world right now? And how could we better understand or complicate these understandings through an intersectional lens?
You know, it's not like not everyone shares the same experience that I have, but something that I found a lot with a lot of the youth, the Muslim youth that I live, work, and volunteer with, and just live life with, quite frankly, is that you're learning your religion through defense, whether it's through your first experiences in elementary school, to high school, to university, so to sports, things that happen in our community, to just being a community member. We're challenged, and a lot of the things that are happening in the world, whether it's the stances that our politicians take, or it's the way the teachers teach certain topics that are happening in class, or the experiences that we have, you know, we don't, like, our lives are not in social vacuums, and everything that's happening in the day-to-day impacts us. So a really unfortunate shared experience of growing up Muslim is learning your religion through defense, and that's something that I've been trying to unlearn as I'm older now, and to really appreciate my religion and how it's grounded me in acts of service, and it's made me the person who I am today. So that's one experience that comes to mind.
And I think that experience is one that we hear often about having to learn the religion through defense. It's something, you know, when I was working with NCCM, we heard from a lot of young people who said exactly the same thing, that they were trying to navigate who they were as a Muslim, how did it fit into their lives, how they could live in these worlds that felt so different at the same time, these two worlds that felt important and different at the same time. And definitely that's been my experience. I'm not that young, but, you know, I was in high school, I don't know, 15 years ago. And it was the same thing, trying to figure out who the heck I was and how I was going to fit this faith that I felt was really important in the context that I was living in. And really just like this idea that young people have the responsibility to educate their teachers or the social worker that works with them, or whoever the adult is around them that needs to understand Islam. And I think it's a really unfair position to put young people in, because they're not scholars. They don't know the answers. They're trying to figure out themselves, and they wear hijab because maybe their parents told them, or because they have a strongly held belief but can't fully articulate it. I remember a few months ago, my daughter's 4, and she, you know, in kindergarten, her teacher came to me and was so proud of her because they read a story that had a main character that had a hijabi, and then she asked Iman if she wanted to come up to the front of the room and talk about hijab. And, you know, Iman tried her best, and she said, "Mom, some Muslim mommies wear it," and that was her thing, right? And I'm thinking, like, okay, teacher has tried. She was trying to, you know, bring diverse pedagogy into the classroom. She was trying to, be representative. But what does my 4-year-old know? Like, I've introduced her to God, but I haven't introduced her to Islam or hijab or anything. Like, she's 4. And so it's just kind of this way that even at that young age, people are meant to represent their faith as if they're like the authority, when they're not. They're also trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I think my work with youth is similar. I think students are saying quite often, regularly, that they need their educators to do the work. Right? They need to put in the time to do the learning, because they can't, and no one student, for example, can represent the story of millions of people throughout the world. And so doing that work to make sure that you have an understanding that Islam is not a monolith, right? That there is diversity, and ensuring that your pedagogy is informed by that diversity, but that you are doing the legwork to engage in that learning for yourself. And also to really address. Students are often commenting on how difficult it is to enter school spaces after there has been, for example, a global or a sensationalized global incident that's taken place. How difficult it is to enter school spaces because the dialogue isn't often being taken up by educators, and or when they become the person that an educator turns to explain something that students don't have the capacity to be able to explain, mostly because it's triggered incredible amounts of trauma for them to begin with, right? So really engaging in an understanding, like even just beyond what's happening in our schools and in our province, so that you are being able to teach and foster those critical pedagogy skills, those critical literacy skills, right? So we're examining global and localized issues in ways that really preserve students' sense of self, right? So. And using public platforms, youth are often saying that instead of having to constantly be on the defense, that if others would use public platforms in order to ensure that they're demonstrating allyship, this is a huge one for them, right? So that they aren't always the people defending.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a funny dance. I think that even as an adult, I always want a caring adult in my life that it doesn't look like me, that's going to support me if something does happen, that's going to validate something that has happened to me, where I'm questioning, is this Islamophobic? Are they targeting me because I wear hijab? And so I think all of us need that person. And if you, from the audience, if you're part of a marginalized group yourself, I think that you can understand that feeling of, being in a space and experiencing sexism or racism or homophobia, and wishing that you weren't the one that had to defend yourself, that wishing that you could live in the kind of feeling of grief that this has taken place and somebody else will stand up for you. But at the same time, I know that it is a funny dance that you have to play, because sometimes the young person is the only Muslim that you have access to. And sometimes I think that a lot of it is about relationship building. Have you built a relationship with that young person to be able to have a conversation? And the conversation needs to go like this: why is this important to you? Not why this is important for the billions of Muslims that live across the world, right? But how is this impacting you? Why is it important to you? Why, I think that that changes the relationship and changes the conversation when you're able to approach it in that way.
Yeah, I think relationships are huge because NCCM does a number of trainings for educators around, how to deal with Islamophobia in the classroom or education system, how to deal with discrimination. In the last few years, we've trained over 4,000 educators. We've found time and time again that, there is an awareness. So we did an evaluation of our trainings, and they noted 2/3 of educators recognize that yes, Islamophobia is an issue, but only 14% of them actually know what to do about it. So I think, yes, the relationship piece is huge, and also kind of, holding yourself accountable, right? Recognizing that there is some learning that I have to do, perhaps some unlearning that I have to do, and do it, right? There's a ton of resources out there. We've attached the NCCM student town hall. So when Gilary was at NCCM, she produced a wonderful report, and that's included as a resource for you folks. So I encourage folks to have a look at that. It really centers the voices of our Muslim high school students, and it kind of, shares with folks what they want, what they need, what's working and what isn't. And so I think that is huge when it comes to support. Going back to intersectionality, how does intersectionality complicate our understanding of the Muslim identity when we're looking at support, when we're looking at those experiences that we've been talking about?
Well, I think when you're seen as a monolith, then that intersectionality gets erased, right? And so you're not understanding that a queer Muslim young person is not asking you to erase their Muslimness. It's not asking you to bash their religion. They're asking you to support them and hold them as they work through what it means to be both Muslim and queer. Or, when somebody is Black and Muslim, particularly Black male and Muslim, the way that they experience anti-Black racism compounded with this idea that they must, have some terrorist tendencies because they're Muslim as well, or a question, even if they are Muslim at all, because of their Blackness, comes into play, right? How does an experience of being a refugee or an immigrant or coming from a lower class background impact how somebody experiences Islamophobia, right? Can they access the things that somebody like me would be able to access if my rights are violated? Probably not. And so I think that there's all of these different layers that need to be thought about as we approach Islamophobia. It's not just, like I said, you have to get to know the people that you're providing services for. You have to understand the nuances of their life, because it's complicated, their experiences of Islamophobia, when they're also dealing with anti-immigrant sentiments, when they're also dealing with anti-Black racism, when they're also dealing with homophobia, when they're also dealing with classes, all of these things, with poverty. I think we need to look at all of us as intersectional beings, and not just as kind of this one idea of who Muslims are.
Yeah, and I think when we do recognize that that diversity within the Muslim community, we recognize that support looks different as well. So I've had folks share with me, like, hey, I have a prayer room set up at work, or I have a prayer room set up in the school, but I'm noticing, students are praying at different times. And so you might be trying to engage in inclusive practices, but it's important for us to recognize that there's diversity within the practice. There's diversity within the Muslim community, and so we all might not practice the same. We all might not look the same. We don't look the same. We all speak different languages, and so that also implies that support would look different as well. So I wanted to kind of touch on why folks might be hesitant to name Islamophobia when they see it or experience it.
What I find interesting is that we did some informal research with youth, and in that research we found that students really quickly identified microaggressions they might be experiencing, like the daily jabs, the daily comments that relate to Muslims or Islam, but they didn't define those microaggressions as synonymous with Islamophobia. And so I think that's what's really important, right? The idea that people might actually not, or students and youth might actually not equate things that are not perceived. In this instance, it was things that were not perceived as violent as Islamophobic at all. And so that was really important for us to note, because there's a bit of learning or unlearning around what discrimination actually looks like, because it's not just the structural pieces, it is the day-to-day interactions, it is the microcosmic, microaggressions as well.
I think the reality is that at a very young age, Muslim youth, racialized youth, marginalized youth learn to downplay their grief, and also learn that they can't trust the adults around them to take care of what's happening. And we carry that into our adulthood. But I think, very, very early on, youth start to understand that they have to kind of brush it off, be the bigger person, be strong. And so what that means is that people don't bring it up. They don't trust that there are folks around that are going to take them seriously, or listen to them. And I think also, like, generationally, our parents have also lived their lives downplaying their trauma. And, we get taught, even at home, don't stir the pot, you don't need to say anything, it's not a big deal, you just have to work hard. And so as people, we buy into that to some extent. As young people, we buy into that to some extent. So I think that at a very young age, unfortunately, people do start to learn what was necessary to survive in a racialized body, in a Muslim body. And that often is about not trusting that others will have your back.
And I just want to build off of that a little bit, because I was thinking along the same lines when you asked that question. But essentially, what I'm seeing in a lot of spaces and with a lot of youth, and in my personal experience, we don't name it, but we understand what it is. And we know like when we're experiencing it, but we don't name it, because a lot of the spaces created for youth, or the spaces that we're in for work or school, they claim to be equitable, to be inclusive, but when claims are brought up, it actually causes a lot more problems, not only like for ourselves and being in that space. So in order to avoid all of the conflict and the lack of action that comes with sometimes naming Islamophobia, a lot of us tend to just it's unfortunately it's a part of the job or the experience, or what we're going through.
And as a young person, like, what are you doing in high school? You're trying to fit in.
Right.
So like, you're not going to be that person really, especially if it's like, it's coming from your peers, it's coming from your friends. And so that's the unfortunate reality, that people don't report, because they also they're trying to survive and trying to maintain their friendships and relationships.
But it's interesting, because if we start to think about like classroom spaces, learning spaces, youth spaces as places where the leaders in those areas like start to create environments where we normalize the calling in. So not even a calling out, but the calling in of okay, so I heard you say that, and I'm hearing this. Did you think about this? If we start to normalize a conversation around fill in the blank with the ism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous, fill in the blank. If we start to normalize that dialogue, we then become really great instruments in changing what the dialogue and the conversation looks like, and allowing people the permission to say, hey, did you know that? You know, it didn't feel good when you said that. This is an example of, right? So if we normalize the naming and the conditions, so I really think that it's like, how is it that we're creating culturally responsive spaces? How is it that we're creating anti-oppressive spaces? And I think that's the work of the leaders in those spaces to start taking charge of. And some people are doing phenomenal jobs, right? I see classroom spaces where kids are calling each other in ways that are meaningful, so that they are supporting each other's growth. And it's incredibly possible.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the kind of the landscape that our youth are navigating right now. Like 42% of Canadians think discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault, right? So this idea of saying, hey, I'm feeling this, or I'm feeling this type of discrimination, this comment was made to me. It's usually downplayed, or like Habon noted, it's a part of the kind of the reality, right? So and I think Ayesha, you noting kind of the calling in, right, and recognizing that we have to disrupt kind of these attitudes to really kind of see systemic change. So I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about how privilege plays itself out within the Muslim community.
Well, in serious ways, as in every community, I think it's about continuing to engage in learning, right? Continuing to engage in an understanding that we all hold privilege, and that we need to recognize what that privilege is, right? So I think about myself like as a cis, hetero, able-bodied Muslim. So like it's incredibly key for me to constantly be allying, to constantly be sharing, creating space, standing alongside sort of my non-binary, trans, non-able-bodied Muslim community members. That's incredibly key. And for me, allyship is about action. So really like demonstrating that I am ensuring that people who might be missing at a table are present at a table.
And I think that the challenges that exist in our broader society around class and race and sexuality and gender exist, in a microcosm within the Muslim community. We're not immune to it, right? And so what people are experiencing in the broader world, we're experiencing in our mosques and our Islamic centers within our own community. It is young people that are pushing for accountability. It's young people that are shifting the dialogue. It's young people who are thinking about alternative ways to organize, alternative ways to be together, defining their Muslimness in this context. It's young people that are requiring mosques to just catch up. And some of them are stepping up to the challenge, and some of them are not. And that's a reality that we're contending with. And I think that for me, I have patience sometimes for the Muslim community, because I also think, we're also trying to deal with the Islamophobia that we face, that we don't have time to have these like big conversations about the diversity that does exist within our community, the challenges that exist in our community, that we're trying to fight this big beast, that we get lost with kind of the nuances. And that's not to excuse, but I think that I become a little bit more patient with how sometimes slow we are. But I've seen some really beautiful things and conversations happening in spaces that traditionally were not friendly to that, right? And people starting to see and understand that our community is diverse. We're starting to see that our community is diverse. People are starting to require us to see that our community is diverse, and that we need to have conversations about how all of these identities fit in. And I think I also see a lot of challenges when it comes to the division of those who are poor and those who've made it financially. And so how do we kind of integrate these ideas into our communities? It's an ongoing conversation, like it is in many communities.
So we're going to talk a little bit about policies and practices as well. And for folks with questions, we will be kind of leaving time at the end, just a reminder. So what policies or practices should folks consider when engaging in youth program planning or implementation?
I mean, I think that there's some I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I think that there's some very basic, I think always a checklist is important when you're thinking about program or policy development in terms of kind of your equity understandings or equity considerations. All of us have spots that we're not thinking about because of our own social location. But, I think on an organizational level, thinking about space and timing, we have special times during the year, Ramadan that's coming up, where some of your young folks will be fasting. What considerations are you making in that case? Are you accommodating their fast? Are you providing meals at the at the start of a program so people can break their fast? Do you have prayer space? Do you have accommodations for those who wear the hijab? Do you have a policy around who is leading? Who are your leaders? Do they look like the community that you're serving, or do they look like they're from the outside of that community? And does that have an impact on how programs are received? So I think asking those type of questions around why are we? What is our goal here? Why are we doing this? And how do we best include individuals is a really good place to start.
Thank you. And one thing I think about a lot is it's really sketchy when there's like youth serving or youth facing organizations, but they don't include youth in their structure. So like they don't hire youth are not planning their programming. I really get weirded out by organizations like that. So I think it's really important if you are a youth serving organization to ask yourself, are you meaningfully including youth in like the planning, the design, the implementation, the evaluation? And like the whole circle, or are you just saying here's a check mark, we discussed this with youth, it's going to impact you as well? Because what I find is that when it's not directed by the community that you're trying to target, these solutions are essentially ineffective. So COVID-19 is happening right now. A lot of youth, unfortunately, their summer internships are gone. I know that there's a lot of youth serving organizations probably on this webinar right now. If you're not including youth meaningfully, now would be a really interesting time to do so and hire youth, pay them for their work. And some organizations that are doing this really well that I can think of right now is Students Commission of Canada, Apathy is Boring, and they have resources on their websites and how to engage youth meaningfully. And as a result, anytime I've interacted with these organizations, they've thought of it all, because it wasn't a back thought or something that they went back to later. It was from the beginning something that they were thinking about the whole time.
Yeah, I think, you know, in our discussion earlier, we talked about the prevalence of Islamophobia, how it's embedded within kind of the current landscape. So when we're thinking about kind of policies and practices, we're finding that folks have to be very intentional about, you know, how is it that I'm going to undo some of, you know, this kind of hegemonic kind of this normative discourse around Islamophobia, these practices that make Islamophobia okay. So it does take a lot of commitment, right? You have to commit to kind of intentionally saying, I'm going to make sure that youth are at the forefront. I'm going to make sure that they're centered in the conversation. And I'm going to make sure that, you know, what they're saying actually matters, right? It's not just a checkbox. It's not just, you know, they're here and that kind of does my quota and I'm done, but really kind of ensuring that it's intentional, it's meaningful, and it comes down to relationships again. So what would you say in terms of provincial policies? We can even go federal, but you know, what are some of those provincial federal policies that are shaping the experiences of Muslim youth? Or the lack thereof?
I mean, I don't think that there are very many provincial policies targeting Muslim youth in particular, which is a main challenge. But I also think that there exists. I mean, that provides space for erasure. I don't know that that young people necessarily have much faith in government to take care of them, and I think that we're seeing things happening in our neighboring Quebec that really kind of exemplifies how government can take policy to completely exclude and discriminate against a population. And I'm talking about the ban of religious symbols of anybody working within the public sector, and we know a lot of our young people are trying to become teachers, trying to become lawyers, trying to become police officers, and they're completely excluded in that province because they choose to practice their faith in an outward way. But I think also, like, for young people, for a very kind of basic example is the ability to go to university or college and need financial assistance, right? And for some young Muslims and their families, they don't take interest as part of their religious practice. And so if you come from a low-income family and you're trying to pursue education because it's a grand equalizer and it'll help you get out of your poverty, you cannot take a loan because of the way that interest is structured within the Ontario government's student loan program. So even that kind of, I don't think anybody was thinking about that when they developed the program. And I think, there's a lot of young people in general that are asking for a release of interest on their loans. But that's one example of how, when you don't have people that look like us around a table making policy decisions, we don't get included. And so, I just think that there is a complete erasure around the table when it comes to Muslim identity, and it has its implications on what messaging, who is included and who is not.
Yeah, and I think when we're looking at even kind of our province, right, the cuts to certain services, right?
Yeah.
And what is the message that those cuts really mean, right? What is it saying to folks who access those services? How important are they to the province, right? When you're thinking about cuts to children's aid, you're looking at services in education, a lot of the social services that youth are accessing, especially, youth who are in precarious positions, those services have been cut. When you talk to a lot of agencies, you can kind of recognize kind of the impact on the lived realities of those youth. And so it's further disenfranchising, further marginalizing youth.
Yeah, and I think, not to get too into it, but I think I've been reflecting a lot on the kind of injection of money into the system during this time, during COVID-19. And while I'm super grateful that the government is taking steps to make sure that people are taken care of, I think the lobbying and the work that grassroots communities have been doing for time to try to get more funding into the education system, trying to get more funding into the hospitals, trying to get more funding into public housing, into the things that people need to survive. It needs to take us a time where we're in complete crisis and we're being faced with our mortality to actually think people need these things to live. And so we've been told that there's no money for these things, right? And disproportionately, is marginalized communities that access these services, that access public housing, that access social services, that access these things. Disproportionately, is people that look like us that access these things. And we've been told that there's no money. And out of nowhere, $29 billion, like Oprah, just throwing it out, right? And so I'm really conflicted in how it's playing out. And I hope that once the dust settles, that we remember that it is about political will. It's not about whether we have it in the budget. It's really about, are you prioritizing us?
Yeah.
I think when I think about policies, something that really sticks with me is the 2015 election we had. And I think that was my last year of high school. And that's what catapulted me into sort of caring about politics and to everything that I'm doing right now. But it's these national debates that are had on like what a Muslim woman can and cannot wear. Is really it impacts the health of like Muslim youth and how we navigate our day-to-day life, and it translates directly into community impacts, whether that is emboldening the person on my morning bus commute to say something Islamophobic because we have a leader that is running to be prime minister who's spewing Islamophobic rhetoric, to essentially using our communities as pawns during elections to gain their seats. And so it's really disheartening. And even with Bill 21, thank you to NCCM for challenging that and leading some of the efforts with that, because we're hearing about discussions about what that would look like in other provinces, and how do Canadians feel about essentially the religious wear that of our day-to-day life. So sort of like our rights are up for discussion, and it's really uncomfortable, and it impacts our experiences. But also I had the immense pleasure of organizing with some of the youth in our community to discuss gun violence. And I live in Rexdale, and how that manifests for youth. And they were talking about their experiences through the TDSP and how that impacted them, and whether it was streaming or Islamophobia or anti-Black racism and how that played out. And we're seeing the federal discussion on like a handgun ban and who's being included in that conversation and who's being included on the provincial level, on the municipal level, on the federal level. And it really impacts a lot of what we're experiencing. And until we include youth meaningfully and include marginalized communities meaningfully, who are these solutions for? I think.
I think that's what she says is really important. And whether it's on a federal or provincial or at a level of your organization, democratizing the development of policy. I think we only think about including people in our program development sometimes, but really, how do you demystify policy, which feels like it's just something that men in suits can talk about, as if we don't know the solutions for our communities, as if we don't know what it is that we need, and perhaps we don't have the language skills or we don't have the education to back it up. But I think that you speak with any youth, mom, grandma, aunt, uncle, they know what is needed in the community. They just don't necessarily have the resources and the backing to be able to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when I think about an educational context, it's exactly the same, right? When we're centering knowing who your learners are, when we're centering pedagogies around being culturally responsive and anti-oppressive, and how it is that our classrooms look, and knowing our learners, and knowing how it is that even we as educators are interfacing with the students in our spaces, really being cognizant of all of those pieces. Really become the precursor to be able to create these environments for youth that allow them to thrive.
Yeah. So I'm going to kind of shift gears into more talking a little bit more about community building, allyship, as well as kind of like strategies and tips for folks who are currently listening or tuning in. So we hear a ton of conversations that center resiliency as a byproduct of Islamophobia, right? So, youth are experiencing this, they're so resilient, right? But how might this impact our understanding of the experiences of Muslim youth and the discourse on Islamophobia?
So for me, the conversation around resiliency, really like, every conversation around resiliency is when my ear is really open, because for me, conversations around, especially in education and we're talking about youth care around resiliency, really like put the onus back on the student, on the youth, on the learner, to be the contributing variable to their success. And for me, like, that's the root cause. It's only and when we decenter resiliency as being wholesomely, leading the charge in whether or not students are going to thrive in spaces, or youth are going to thrive in their spaces, like, until that's decentered and we recenter our conversation around what are the barriers that youth are having in the spaces that they're occupying, like, that needs to be, for me, the center of the conversation. What are the barriers they are experiencing? How is Islamophobia playing out in those spaces? And what are we doing to listen and to work with in order to address what those barriers are? For me, that's where the conversation really has to be.
Mm-hmm. I think that once people start to understand that it's exhausting to have to constantly be resilient and constantly have to walk an uphill battle, then we'll make some progress. If you're saying that your youth are resilient, it's a problem. And so what are you doing to help them through that? To release some of that burden, because it's unacceptable that young people have to think about, how do I fight to be seen, while at the same time trying to get good grades and help my family put food on the table and do my part-time job and pay off my student loan and be a young person and understand what it is to be Muslim, and like all of these things that a young person shouldn't have to do on top of fighting the racism or Islamophobia that they're experiencing. And so it does really, I think that people say the community is so resilient as a compliment almost, but it's not. And it's you acknowledging that we have just had to throw up our hands and take it, and that you have done no work to help us challenge it.
So for folks who are working in the youth sector, what practical steps can they take to ensure that they are supporting Muslim youth and communities?
Talk to them.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds simple, and I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm just, I think that often we're scared to ask the questions. We're scared to get it wrong. And I think that understanding that you will get it wrong, but you've built relationships that allow for you to, for people to let you make mistakes is really important. I think that you have to get to know the community that you're serving, create allies with other members of community. Like, who is your local mosque? Is that where your young people are going? Maybe they're actually not going there. Maybe they don't trust the leadership there. Maybe they're going to a community center, or they're congregating in other places. Who's the leadership there? Who do they already trust? I think building those relationships is super important. I think, doing your own research about what Muslims need is important. Reaching out to NCCM, who has said we will educate you, is a great way to start, so that when you come with your questions, we know that you've already done some work. Right? I've heard this. Is this accurate? Is this what you need? You don't how far it goes to have an event on an evening of Ramadan and offer people food to break fast. Like, that's a really simple place to start and have people know and understand that you've thought about them, and that the food is halal, and that you have a space for prayer, and that these things are just given and not things that people have to ask for or fight for.
Yeah, and Ramadan
really
is coming
point.
up. Yeah.
And another thing that's important is really meeting youth where they're at. And like, I think a lot of the youth programs that exist right now are geared towards like high functioning youth. And yeah, there's privilege in that. There's a huge amount of privilege, but what barriers are there to accessing your programs? Who are your programs directed towards? Are you really reaching everyone, or are you catering to a select few, students or young people who have the same resumes, who have done the same programs, who are from the same school? Or are you really doing the work to reduce the barriers, whether it be financial, whether it be accessibility, whether it be how you view applicants, and what your idea of like that perfect person is to go through your program? So I think it's important to look at that, include youth in the process. I know Apathy's Boring recently released Together We Rise. It's a report, and it includes a lot of really good recommendations. So that's an important place to start too, I think, if folks are looking for resources.
The youth that I work with also speak a lot about the desire, the craving the want of representation, of seeing themselves across sectors where adults are engaging with youth, right? Where they actually see themselves in the people that are supporting them. That's a really important one as well, because it really increases their scope of what is possible for them as well. And so that's a really huge one. In educational spaces, youth are really specific about the things that they need. And so I'm going to go through a few things that our research has shown. So it's really, and everyone's mentioned them, but it's very specific about self-education and understanding that diversity that we've been talking about all day, and understanding what that intradiversity means for them as we are layering the multiple oppressions that they might be experiences every single day through microaggressions and through even like structural pieces, and providing culturally responsive supports. So engaging in supports where allies and perhaps Muslim, for example, social workers and other well-being staff actually can have a depth of understanding about Islam and all of its intradiversities, even across sex. And deeply understanding faith accommodations, like we've talked about Ramadan, but even the day-to-day, youth come into our spaces with their own toolkit of well-being, right? Some of it is very faith-based, and so really being able to understand what those conditions and needs are, so that students can be well in all of the spaces, or youth can be well in all of the spaces that they are engaging with you in. And combating that critical media literacy, that critical literacy, and leveraging really your power and positionality at the tables, right, to make space for youth at those tables as well, whether it's on a public platform or whether it is at a boardroom table, and so really making those priorities in how it is that the work is carried out, so that you're actually actualizing really what anti-oppressive work should look like.
Yeah,
I know that we're talking about youth, but I also I want to emphasize that it's important that you take care of your racialized staff as well, and your Muslim staff as well, because I think that they also often, because I worked in social service area enough to know that often it's the dominant group that occupies most of the spaces, and that people who look like me don't have positions of power very often, and often are relegated to be the Muslim, the Black person, on top of whatever job that they're already doing. So I think that it's important to consider what are the needs of those people as well. How are you supporting their mental health in navigating these spaces? Is it fair that it only falls on their lap to troubleshoot these issues, or is there work organizationally that needs to happen to ensure that everybody bears the responsibility of ensuring that young people feel safe and included in the work? So I think that, and once young people start to see that the leadership that looks like them is always taken care of and happy, they will have trust in your organization. They will have trust that you will also extend that to them as young people. So I think it's really important to think about the burden that some of your staff take on, because people see them as part of their community and will come to them when things happen.
Yeah, I love that, Gilary. And creating those opportunities for allowing, whether it is your employees or whether it is the youth themselves, to gather in affinity. That's really huge, right? That shared safe space, creating the conditions. And then also, not just about creating those conditions through funding or through just creating supportive environments, but it's about then going to those tables to listen and to hear and to inform next directions, right, in your organization as well. So I think those are really key to actually showing that you are demonstrating allyship.
So what is meaningful allyship? How do we define that? Sorry, Habon, go ahead.
That's okay. I was talking about how listening is incredibly important, and when you include youth and they give you recommendations, or what they come up with is completely different from what you originally thought, or goes against the direction that you're going with, that you can still move with it. I think it's a lot of the times youth are included, and once we outline the red flags, or this wouldn't work for our community, some programs or some organizations still go on through with it. So really, like, not just including us to just listen and then go do the original plan, but to take in what we're saying in a meaningful way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's hugely important.
I think for allyship, I think taking your ego out of it is important, and understanding that just because I did it right today doesn't mean I'm going to do it right tomorrow. Or just because I've been doing this for a long time, that I've been doing it right for a long time, you've likely been doing it wrong. So I think having that understanding and being able to humble yourself to, yes, I'm getting paid to be the program director or the service provider, but really I have a lot to learn from the community that I'm serving, and perhaps I just need to bring an interpreter or give them the language or do things to allow them to feel like they can contribute. But really it is about bringing down your pride and your ego, and also thinking about what resources can I give to community so they can lead themselves, right? That you're just kind of the avenue for things to happen, but you're not this, like, you haven't positioned yourself as the leader because nobody elected you to be there. It's just, you know, you got hired, and so how can you leverage that power?
Yeah, I think when it comes to meaningful allyship, like when I think of allies in my life, you know, they've done a ton of microaggressions, right? They've made a ton of mistakes, but that doesn't mean that they can't be allies. You know, you're not going to be perfect, right? For folks who are listening, who are like, you know, I'm not Muslim, how do I ally with Muslim communities or Muslim folks in my, you know, my youth group? You are going to make mistakes, right? I think Kika Ojo makes a really good point around anti-oppressive practice, right? It's a practice. You're not going to be perfect at it. You're going to make a ton of mistakes, but that doesn't mean you don't try again, right? So ensuring that, you know, you're holding yourself accountable, like Habon noted, right? Make sure that you actually are at the table to listen, right? And meaningfully implement what community is sharing with you, because having that trust, being able to kind of sit in a space with folks from community who are marginalized, having them share with you, that's an honor, right? That's a privilege, that's privileged information. And so really ensure that you're taking that and honoring that, and it's showing up, right? Changes are happening, steps are being taken to kind of truly incorporate that into your program.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think that we need you to know every little detail about what it means to be a Muslim. And I don't even need you to understand it. Like, I get it. Watching us fast all day in the middle of summer with no water is weird. Like, I get it. But, and so I don't even need you to fully understand, but I do need you to respect. And I think that's what most people do require, some respect and some kindness, you know. I think that those pieces are important.
So before we kind of wrap up, I know we talked about a ton of things. I do want to leave time for questions. And I'm ending with a big one, but, you know, what are some tips to build community capacity and to coalesce alongside other communities, groups, or organizations? It's a big question.
It's a big question. I think it's really intentional design, right? I think when we are creating intentional opportunities, regular opportunities to come together across communities, across sectors, all in the hope of addressing, you know, youth needs, I think that's key. So like normalizing in our practices, those community conversations for me is really, really important.
I think for me, like I said before, is kind of mapping who is in your community, who are already the community leaders that maybe you haven't engaged, who has been doing this work unpaid and overworked, that you can bring into the fold and make them a meaningful part of your organizing. I think, you know, to some extent, do your own research is important, but also know that, like, Google is the cesspool for all things bad when it comes to this stuff. So I think important is building relationships with the Muslims within your spaces, and or, you know, compensating organizations to come and talk to you about this and give you their 3 hours to answer all of the questions that you have deep rooted that maybe you're embarrassed to ask out loud.
And I'm directing this towards youth serving organizations, but your goal is to support youth, and we all have the same goal. So if you're looking for ways to support Muslim youth that will have better outcomes for all of us, as cliche as it sounds, like youth engagement is a buzzword, but only positive things can come out of it. And it might not be easy, but I think that's what we have to acknowledge, that it's going to require some work, and it's going to have positive outcomes for all of us in the end of it. Yeah. Because we're part of the community and we all have the same goals. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. Like often, even like in conversations around kind of when we think about youth in general, right? We're often talking about them in like the future tense, right? Like youth are our future. What do you want to be when you're older? Like, but recognizing, you know, the gifts that they bring right now in that moment is huge, right? So really taking what they're saying and ensuring that we're implementing that. And I think, you know, when we're talking about coalescing, it goes back to kind of recognizing our own privilege, right? And how we can ally meaningfully with other groups to amplify their voice, right? So looking at it through an intersectional lens is hugely important. Thinking about, you know, what privileges do I have? What power do I have, and how can I use that power to amplify the voice of this group? And how are our experiences similar? How are they different? And kind of, you know, creating coalitions that way can be extremely powerful. All right, so that's all the questions I had, but I'm sure folks, I'm hoping folks have questions. So I guess we're ready for the questions, if Kat wants to share them.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions, and if there are any questions that you all feel that you wanted to go back to, we definitely have a little bit of space for that now. But someone asked a question about any guidance that you may be able to provide to folks who may be working in different communities in different parts of the province. So how Islamophobia may play out differently for Muslim youth in different communities. So, you know, in urban communities versus rural communities. If you have any sense of resources or supports or things that youth workers can keep in mind, because youth workers are often the first point of contact for young people. So any suggestions you may have or any insight you may provide into that, that was something that did come up through the conversation.
Yeah, I think looking at each kind of area as its own unique kind of set of kind of variables. So like not all places in Ontario are the same, right? Recognizing each community is different, having kind of that environmental mapping, like knowing, you know, who are the folks in this community, what are their needs, what is the makeup, what are the resources and supports out there. You know, we've done trainings in kind of remote parts of Ontario. So, you know, I've traveled to Thunder Bay, and then I remember walking into a school to do a training, and, you know, it was very obvious that there wasn't many racialized students or many Muslim students. But when I walked in, I saw, you know, eyes of like 3 students light up, right? And after the training, they ran up to me and they noted that, you know, we're Syrian newcomers, right? We're new to this community. We're new to Thunder Bay. And so they shared kind of those feelings of, yes, like I'm so grateful to be here, to be safe, but also I'm experiencing a ton of discrimination and I feel really isolated. Right? Very few folks look like me here. There's very few supports. And so kind of just recognizing, going back to the idea that, you know, all, you know, even individual Muslims are very different, but, you know, when you look at the community clusters, those also will be really, really different. And just being mindful of that when you're thinking about support. And I think, you know, folks on the panel brought up some really great kind of strategies to kind of map out what the community's like, right? Doing that kind of community consultation, building those relationships, getting to know who's out there would really help in kind of thinking about how to look at this on a more local municipal level across Ontario.
I think that when you're thinking about Muslims or Muslim youth living in a rural setting versus an urban setting, in a rural setting, I imagine, I've never lived in a rural setting, but I imagine that the weight of Muslimness is really heavy on your shoulders because people don't have a reference. They have the media as a reference and then they have you. And so there's no other kind of point. I live in Toronto, there's a diversity of Muslims here. And so people are seeing the different ways that Muslims live, which helps my argument when I tell you we are diverse, right? But when you go to someone like Thunder Bay and your only Muslims are the new Syrian refugees that have moved into the block, you know, it's just one area of reference. So I like Aasiyah said, I imagine that isolation is one piece, but also even understanding yourself as a Muslim who has moved from one context to another, and you're now dealing with language barriers and poverty and being a refugee and war trauma and all of those things. And then also this idea of who you are as a Muslim when you're trying to figure out who you are as a Muslim. Because even like coming from a context where it is a majority Muslim country, that it's kind of, your Muslimness is kind of defined, it's defined for you, and some wear hijab and some don't wear hijab, and you are Muslim, and sometimes it's just a cultural thing, and it is what it is, right? And now you're here where you're being asked to explain yourself, and you're being labeled in a particular way, but that's not how you've labeled yourself. And so I think the benefit of being a Muslim in an urban setting almost sometimes is that we do have the freedom to be, you know, as diverse as we want to be, because there's so many of us, there's room for that. But when you're in a rural setting, you're it. And so I imagine that burden is heavily placed. But I mean, on the flip side, I think if you're the first Muslim that somebody is interacting with, it, you know, it's that there's also that burden of being that first interaction and that first opportunity for somebody to ask a question with a real life Muslim, like we're an animal in a zoo or something. You know what I mean?
We did have another question from someone who facilitates a group for refugee youth, and the homophobia that came up amongst the Muslim youth who are participating in this group. And I know we've talked about intersectionality, and there oftentimes is a focus on, you know, this idea of being culturally competent. But of course, you know, as much as we need to do our work and know where our gaps are and where our biases are, you know, we also have to meet each person where they're at. And you talk so much about the incredible diversity among Muslim youth.
Yeah.
You know, when there are differences, when issues like homophobia come up, are there insights that you can provide to youth workers for how they may mitigate that, whether they themselves are Muslim or not?
For me, I think a lot about those conversations as learning opportunities. On any topic, the more knowledge we have, the more exposure we have, the more dialogue we engage in, the greater the clarity, right? The greater the opportunity to unlearn something. And so my work with 2S LGBTQ students and youth has always shown me that creating opportunities for youth to co-dialogue as well have been the most valuable learning opportunities in sort of reforming or resetting mindsets that might be, you know, that are discriminatory. And so using youth in ways that are supportive towards, you know, repairing mindsets, for me, has been really successful in school spaces.
I think also there are lots of, I wouldn't say lots, but there are community organizations that are run by Muslims who are queer. That I think that to make, if it's something that you feel is an issue within the community that you're working with, or you're trying to find support for one young person in particular, those are areas that you can, or organizations that you can lean on to find some support and to bridge the conversation. But I also think, you know, sometimes we wrap our, like, how are we going to talk with Muslim youth about homophobia? But how would you talk about homophobia with any group of youth, right? And we know that it exists amongst youth. You walk through any high school and you hear the homophobic comments that are passed amongst friends or peers. And so how do we have those conversations with youth in general about respect, about consent, about sexuality, about gender identity, about all of those things? So I think, you know, to some extent, while there are community organizations that are happy to support and come in and talk to your youth about what it is like to be queer and Muslim, also demystify what it means to talk about sexuality or these issues that seem taboo for our community, because they are taboo for communities across the spectrum, and we find ways to talk with other youth about this. And I think those strategies would succeed here as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier about like really normalizing dialogue, right? Checking
Yes.
in, understanding, like bridging gaps of knowledge. Like it's really just like engaging in conversation so that we understand where it is that this previous learning has come from, and moving people along wherever they are in their learning. Like I think that's the key when working with youth and with working with adults.
Yeah, I think building strategies for, like you said, that dialogue. So as somebody who maybe has some questions about Islam and Muslims, how would you like that dialogue to go? What kind of parameters would you like to be set so that you could be honest about how you're feeling, or what questions you have? What facilitator would be useful for that kind of conversation, and apply those rules to a conversation about homophobia amongst Muslim youth? So what spaces can you create for them to have open and honest conversations about where those feelings are coming from, in a way that they can get checked, but in a way that's warm and comforting, and that they can actually unpack their understanding. And it is going to take them time to fully grasp or understand these things. And some of them might be queer themselves, but can't or don't feel comfortable coming out. Lots of things might happen after creating that kind of space. But I think, how do you create opportunities for dialogue that feel safe and inclusive, and that people can come, even with their problematic behavior, but understand that there's rules for engagement?
I'm aware of the time. I know we only have a few minutes left, and so I wonder if it's an opportunity for everyone to share a final thought or a final takeaway from today's conversation for folks who've been attending and who will be viewing this webinar later. I just want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to share one last time before we wrap up for this morning.
I mean, I think I'll go back to what I was just saying, that first and foremost, I think folks just need to see Muslim youth with their Muslimness, but also as young people trying to understand how to navigate space. And so it's going to take a level of patience and compassion and understanding and relationship building, but you can do it. You have the skills to do it. And it is really about knowing that you're going to have questions about who we are, and once you build those relationships, you'll be able to ask those questions and gain some understanding and perspective, and really thinking about, how do I center the voices of these young people and give them the tools to speak for themselves, and the resources to be able to speak for themselves.
Absolutely. And for me, it's about intentionally listening to understand what current barriers are for success. And then being equally responsive when you hear what those barriers are, being responsive and taking actions in whatever your sphere of influence or power is, in order to make some change that's viable.
I just wanted to say I'm so happy that this conversation is being had, because I don't think I've come across this in the past couple of years. But also, like, all issues are youth issues, and if you're looking to engage in Muslim youth, this is a very positive step forward, and I'm excited to see what comes out of it. So thank you for joining us as well, and listening to our experiences. And
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was a perfect way to end. All issues are youth issues. So thank you so much.
And thank you all so much for joining us, for sharing your experiences and your insights. This is a really important conversation for us to be having. And we really appreciate the time that everyone took to join us today. We look forward to any feedback that you may have about this webinar, about other webinars that you would like to see from YouthREX going forward. We encourage you all to stay connected. We want to hear about the challenges you're facing. We want to hear about your successes, especially over the coming weeks and months, because as you know, we are all in this together. So take care of yourselves and be well, and have a good Tuesday. Thank you again so much for being with us today. Bye.